Um, okay, so let's move on with our stuff. And I think the first thing that we want to talk about is dating fossils. I mean, dating fossils as far as how old they are, not a date like as in cc's. Um, anyone get that? Okay.
Yeah.
That's where all my dates are at, so I think I'm joking too. Radiometric dating, of course, is going to be the process by which you can determine the age of the fossil or fossils. It uses various isotopes. Probably the most common isotope to use is going to be which one? Correct, carbon-14. However, there's a limitation to carbon-14, and that is that its half-life is about 5,700 years or so. And if you do the math, like it's a first-order decay reaction or formula that you would use, and kind of your limitation is about 75,000 years, which means that if you find a fossil that is older than that, carbon probably would not be the preferred isotope. You probably would use something else, a different isotope, maybe one that's got a half-life that is much larger than that. And since the age of the Earth is well above 75,000 years, according to biologists, it would be expected the fossils that we would find would be above that age bracket. So it would have to make sense that you would be using different isotopes. You can also use magnetism to provide relative dates. And that's all about the reversal of the magnetic poles that exist on this planet. As those poles reverse, this kind of leaves like a running record, if you will, as far as to the age of stuff. I think it would be a good time to look at this. So I'm going to show you something real quick. And yeah. Okay, so what we have here is we have the history of life on this planet, the origin of the Earth about 4.6 or so billion years ago, and of course that leads all the way up to, now, right? I want us to know that there are three major eras. And then the eras that I think we should know would be like Paleozoic era, Mesozoic, and then Cenozoic. All the different periods, like for instance the Triassic, Jurassic periods, Cretaceous periods. I don't think there's anything that you need to know about that. And really, we're all only about relative dates, I think. And we're not really concerned about dates of when like different things were formed or when they were evolving. I think that our concern would be mostly with like major advancements. Like for instance, we'll talk today excuse me, about how the oxygen levels increased at a certain time frame. I think it's important that you know when oxygen levels increased or when they began to increase. I think it's important that you know a couple of major like extinction points and a couple of major diversity points, but every date really not important. As long as you know Cenozoic is the most recent, the one that we're in, and then Mesozoic was the one right before that, I think you should be fine. So, let's talk about the history of Earth. According to this little drawing, the Earth began, or the Earth was formed about how long ago? So, formation 4.6 billion years ago, BYA. the first life or the first living creature, which would be post a protobiont. So this would be a protobiont that like is actually a real cell. It would be about 3.5 billion years ago. And of course, that first life, that first living creature, what type of domain would that belong in? So prokaryote. Really not a domain, but it's type of cell. The domain probably would have been eubacteria. Even though archaeobacteria, the extremophiles, like the planet would be, I think that right now the data shows that it would be a eubacteria or just a bacteria that would exist. And these prokaryotes like ruled over the planet. So prokaryotes only. From 3.5 billion years to 2.1 billion years ago. So as you can see, it was like a long period of time, 1.4 billion years, when this planet contained just these little bacteria, rocking it out basically, little nasties everywhere. And then you had a couple of major events. And I think one of the biggest events that happened was the formation. Well, hold on, before we get there, let's talk about O2 levels and how they begin to increase at about 2.7 or so billion years ago. Rough date. Now, how could oxygen increase to such a degree? Where's that coming from? Where's our oxygen coming from today? Plants. But prokaryotes were only, at this 2.7 million years ago, it was only prokaryotes, right? So oxygen began to accumulate at a time where plants weren't. What does that have to mean? The bacteria were doing photosynthesis. So this would be a prokaryotic form of photosynthesis. Those bacteria are still around today. And they are the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria. Now, what happened in about 2.1 billion years? What would have to be that next step? You'd have to have eukaryotes. At 2.1 billion years ago, eukaryotes evolve. Now, what is the discerning difference between prokaryote and eukaryote? Nucleus is the big one, but that's not the only one. I need something else. Most prokaryotes are multicellular, but protists are eukaryotes, and they are unicellular, some of them. Say what? Internal structures, and be maybe more specific in that they were membrane-bound structures, right? We call those what? Organelles. So the eukaryotes, that's basically saying organelle creatures. Now, where could these organelles have come from?
If they had like the endosomality.
Exactly. These prokaryotes that we mentioned before, some of them were big and some of them were small, and the bigger ones actually kind of ate up, if you will, the smaller ones. So what did that mean? Well, you had super prokaryote now. You had prokaryote. Here's your prokaryote. And here's another little prokaryote. And the big prokaryote eats the small one. So that now your small prokaryote is inside of the big prokaryote. Do we see that right there? What's that called again? Right. Endosymbiotic theory. This idea that once upon a time there would have to be prokaryotes engulfed by other prokaryotes. Now, is this really a prokaryote at this point in time, by definition? No, because of course the other things that's going to be like creating along this pathway would be like a nucleus. You're gonna end up with a nucleus somehow along the way. So this is not really super prokaryote. This is actually now eukaryote. Right? Now, that 2.1 billion years, in which case this occurred, I've actually seen it also as 1.8 billion years ago in some books. So, again, when you're talking about billions of years, which is a lot of time, I mean, a billion years is a lot of time, of course, but the difference between 1.8 and 2.1, I mean, is actually just, it is a lot in reality, but when you're comparing these 2 billions of years, it's actually not that much of a difference. So it's an estimate. That's all about it is. Cool? And from about this point onward, you had tons of eukaryotes. Now we've still got to get to multicellularity, but before we move on from that, I think I really want to point out that this concept that one cell could take in another and make that taken in cell a specialized organelle is like one of the most like valuable relics that biology could ever do. I mean, if you were talking about making something amazing, I think it would be this. If you think about even just like human history, some of the best and brightest companies out there have stolen an idea and made it their own. Am I correct on that? I mean, this world is full of just taking an idea and making it better, and now it's your idea, or it's their idea maybe, but it's better.
Has anyone like tried to replicate like they did with the Miller?
They have tried to, but I don't think that there's been a lot of success. Now, I will say that when you look at a mitochondria or a chloroplast or one of these types of organelles that is going to be endosymbiotically related, and you just stare at it, and then you spend a day looking and seeing how it replicates and how it like uses its circular DNA, and then you stare at a microscope of a bacteria for a day, you'll see that those two, you would mistake it. You would think a mitochondria was a bacteria. And so couple like those facts with the other fact that it's got that double membrane around it, there's that proof that that's the way it would have to have gone. So it's like, taking a technology and, putting your box around it and just using the pieces of someone else, and repackaging it as your own. Yes? This right here? It's a prokaryote. Well, not a eukaryote. It's just a circle. It's a depiction of like a cell. It was a prokaryote, and then it took in another prokaryote, so it was a eukaryote. So endosymbiotic theory. And if there was one thing I would encourage you to really remember on this test, it's that happens a lot of times. There's a lot of organelles in our cells, so it would make sense that this event wasn't just a one-time accident. This was a multi-time accident, right? Now, where do you think, for the sake of plants, where do you think their chloroplasts were derived from? If you were to pinpoint a bacteria out there, where do you pinpoint the bacteria? It makes sense that this would have been the bacteria that was engulfed to make a chloroplast. So, became the chloroplast. Cool. At about 1.5 or so billion years ago, so about 1.2 billion years ago, the first multicellular eukaryotes evolved. Cool. Now, these multicellular eukaryotes, when we think of that, I think we think a lot of like land type creatures and stuff like that. But really, up until this point, the entire planet is still like water based, and by that I mean life is confined to the water. There is land, but it's about rock, basically rock. There are some bacteria that live on the land, but as far as your multicellular creatures, they're going to start in the water, because when you look at these first eukaryotes are going to be what we call the protists. And the protists are always water-based creatures. When people say don't drink the water, it's usually don't drink the protists that are in the water, is what they should say. Kidney failure, gas, diarrhea, you name it, you could get it from drinking bad water. It's because of protists. Cool. And it took about 1 billion years for these eukaryotes, from the first eukaryotes, to evolve into something like quite specialized, having like an ability to conquer the land. There was a period of time called the Cambrian explosion that I think we want to know. One of the few periods of time that I think we need to know. Explosion would be like in a sense of explosion of biological species, but not an earthly explosion. This was a time in which many modern-like creatures evolved. I would put this date probably at about 500 million years ago, or 500 million years. And when I say the modern-like creatures, I'm really referring to most of your invertebrates. Speaking of that, did everyone get their invertebrate list printed off on the internet last night? My website? I have a website, right? Did anyone print it off?
I tried.
Good. Okay. That's okay. We'll figure out something today. So, yeah, there's that. Let's see. Plants and fungi began to colonize land at about 470 or so million years ago. Probably together. Your first tetrapods. Of course, tetra would mean four, so tetrapod would mean like four-legged little creatures. Would be about 365 million years ago. Thinking of like little amphibians. And really, it was about this time that something happened to our lands. What was the land like up until this period? One big mass. What's that big mass called? Pangea? We all remember what Pangea is, right? Like from about the 4th grade. It's when you have the supercontinent. All of the continents, Africa, Europe, right? Asia, like they all were once connected. And about this time, it all breaks up. Now, of course, they don't just separate like their distance like in one day. You know, it took years to do, right? There's this like this country is moving like an inch, I think, to the east or something like that a year, I think, or something along those lines, or maybe it's west. I forget now. But there is like tectonic movement all the time. Agreed? And so, if you give it enough time, in theory, the continents could have moved around a whole lot. Good? Now, what happens as those continents separate? What fills the void? Water. And what happens like when you have enough water? You're separated, right? Unless you have a boat. You have an ocean. Now, what type of speciation would that be? Would that be now allopatric or sympatric? So now we have allopatric speciation. Because we've separated the land masses. Allopatric speciation. Cool? This would explain like the flying squirrel, which I think is like in Australia, and the North American squirrel, which you know where that's at.